Hello, I'm Diana Aubrey, a private music instructor in Hodgenville, and also I have been on the KMTA board since 1986. I would like to introduce a conference session that will be presented by Dr. William Budai, and the conference session is Beyond for Elise, the Pedagogical Works of Ludwig van Beethoven. This session will provide an overview of Beethoven's pedagogical compositions appropriate for young students, from his easiest Écossaises and German dances to his most accessible sonatas, along with a discussion of his keyboard style and articulation. Dr. Budai is a professor of piano and associate dean of the School of Music at Campbellsville University, where he teaches both undergraduate and graduate piano and piano pedagogy classes, as well as class piano and music literature. Previously, he taught piano at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, and served as the executive director of the IUPUI Music Academy, a community music school affiliated with IUPUI. He holds degrees from Central Michigan University, Bowling Green State University, and the University of Oklahoma, where he studied piano with Dr. Edward Gates and piano pedagogy with Dr. Jane McGrath and Dr. Reed Alexander.
Greetings. My name is Bill Budai, and I'm here at Campbellsville University. I'm honored to be part of this year's KMTA virtual conference, or state conference, and I want to thank you for taking time to be part of this presentation, which I've entitled Beyond for Elise, the Pedagogical Works of Ludwig van Beethoven. Now, Beethoven actually wrote over 85 works for solo piano, and yet every student wants to play the same piece for Elise. Of course, there's reasons for that, but I'm hoping through this presentation today to introduce you to some new pieces, pieces that may interest your students as well as yourself. Before I get into the music, though, I want to take a moment first to discuss with you the leveling of literature that I'm going to use throughout this presentation. The various levels of pieces I will mention are based on Dr. Jane McGraw's leveling of intermediate piano works. A description of these levels can be found in the beginning of her book, A Pianist's Guide to Standard Teaching and Performance Literature. To help you get your bearings, give you a frame of reference, I'll point out just a few of these. There are 10 levels total, but level 3 is where we start the Kabalevsky Opus 39, Pieces for Young People. When you get to level 6, we're talking about Clementi's Sonatinas. That's level 6, Sonatina level. Some of the Bergmüller etudes as well are at this level. Level 7 is Bach's easiest two-part inventions, and then level 9 would be Bach's easiest three-part inventions, and then beginning some Haydn sonata movements as well. So I mentioned earlier that Beethoven wrote 85 pieces for piano, but probably none are played or attempted to be played more than For Elise. For Elise is actually a level 7 work, so it's above, a little more difficult than the typical Sonatina type piece. It is perhaps his most popular work. It's just really a rondo with two contrasting episodes. But it's the second section here where piano teachers typically hold their breath. I mean, isn't this how every piano teacher looks when the student tries to play this section? The piece is obviously more challenging than the opening theme would suggest. The performance tempo itself has to be determined by the speed at which these 30-second notes can be played. Well, in the face of its continuing popularity, I would like to move beyond For Elise and offer to you some alternatives. Beethoven has many, often overlooked, gems for the advancing pianist. Now, some of his easiest and most accessible pieces for piano are dances. Many people are surprised to learn that Beethoven wrote many different dances, and as a result, these short works are often overlooked as teaching pieces. Let's begin with his Écossaises. The Écossais was a popular dance in 2/4, very similar to the country dance we'll discuss in a moment. Probably Beethoven's easiest piece for the budding pianist would be his Écossais in G major, that you see here. This charming and jovial work is probably Beethoven's most accessible composition and a favorite with elementary students. Using the leveling system I mentioned earlier, this piece would be considered a level 2, which is solidly a beginning level piece. Kind of as a side note here, this Écossais was actually written by Beethoven for military band, but the original score was lost. And what we have today is actually Carl Czerny's piano arrangement. When introducing this piece to a child, I think it's important to highlight the 3 musical jokes, these humorous elements in the piece. The first is this wrong beat, or the syncopation that occurs frequently in this piece. The second is the wrong note you see in this measure here. And then the third is these, I call them belly laughs in the left hand, these left hand octaves. Another Écossais to highlight is this one here in E flat major, works with opus number 86. It's a simple binary work with question and answer structure, along with its oompa left hand accompaniment, right hand single note melody. This makes this piece another one of Beethoven's easiest compositions. Comparing it to the previous piece, I would classify this a level 3. It's just a bit more difficult technically. Of course, not all of the Écossais are that easy. A fun and delightful example would be this collection of 6 Écossaises and his works without opus number 83. This work would be classified as level 7, same level as for Elise. It's an early intermediate work, so it's up there with the Kuhlhaus Sonatinas, the easiest Bach 2-part inventions. Here's the beginning of the first Écossais. And the second half sounds like this. Although written as 6 Écossais, the piece really should be played in its entirety. Most of these Écossaises are comprised of only 2 sections, and the second is always the same, what you just heard here, this catchy sequential passage with octave leaps in the left hand. And while not dances, I want to include here his 2 Russian folk songs from Opus 107, since they are also some of his most accessible works for piano. These would be levels 3 and levels 4. They're very commonly found in anthologies, so played frequently by students. They're great pieces. But again, as a side note, they're actually transcriptions taken from a chamber work that Beethoven wrote for flute and piano. The third one you see on the screen here in G major is a delightful little piece. And this one, number 7 in A minor, is often titled Little Minka. Well, other very accessible dances by Beethoven include his country dances and his German dances. The country dances, also called Ländler, are all basically levels 4 to 6. These are spirited dances which originated in England. They were danced by a line of men and a line of women facing each other. And the music is typically based on folk tunes, often 8-measure phrases. A few collections to know here are included on the screen for you. Beethoven's German dances vary quite a bit in difficulty. They go from level 3 to level 7. These are fast triple meter dances, really a forerunner of the waltz, and many of these appear frequently in various anthologies. And speaking of the waltz, Beethoven actually composed some delightful little waltzes for piano. Some of these do show up occasionally in anthologies, and they generally range in difficulty from levels 3 to 7, like the German dances. One I'd like to highlight is this one here, this waltz in E flat major. This really is a fine work with a beautiful legato melody line over an oom-pa-pa accompaniment. It's a level 6 piece, and it really, I think, should be better known. It'd be a great piece to precede the Bagatelles, which we'll discuss in just a moment. His waltz in D major is also worthy of consideration. This would probably be, though, level 7. Before we can discuss the next genre, his bagatelles, I need to briefly mention his minuets so we can wrap up our discussion on Beethoven's dances and dance forms. Beethoven has several collections of minuets, including the ones listed on the screen here. I think the collection you really should know, though, is the last one, the 6 minuets worked without opus number 10. These are very nice works. They range in difficulty from level 4 to level 8, which is getting to upper intermediate level. They are all minuets and trios. In particular, I'd like to highlight 2 of these. This first one, in C major, which has full chords and a rich sonority. There's some dramatic writing here, and does require expansion and contraction of the hands. This specific minuet, I think, would be level 5. And of course, the ever popular Minuet in G major. This is a level 7 piece. This melody, I've listed on the screen for you here, the opening line of the minuet and then the opening line of the trio, just to kind of jog your memory here. This melody was made famous by the Music Man. In the Music Man, it's used for the Think system. It's a level 7 piece because it consists of thirds and dotted rhythms, making it potentially a good vehicle for technical development in these areas. One additional minuet you should be acquainted with is Minuet Trio in E-flat major, number 82. This perennial favorite includes lots of full chords, creating kind of a quasi-orchestral quality. There are some rhythmical difficulties in this piece, and it does require careful voicing. I would say it's more challenging than it might first appear, which is why it's labeled a level 8 piece. Next, I want to turn our attention to the Bagatelles. It's a somewhat curious title for a composition. Bagatelle is a French word that means trifle. Dictionary.com defines a bagatelle as something of little value or importance, a trifle. However, this definition doesn't adequately describe Beethoven's bagatelles. They are certainly more than just trifles. His bagatelles really are miniature masterpieces. Musically speaking, a bagatelle is a light, short piece. Although the term was first used in music by Couperin, it was Beethoven who truly established the bagatelle as a musical composition. And his bagatelles have been highly influential on subsequent composers, and some consider these pieces to be the forerunner of the 19th century character piece. Beethoven composed 3 sets and various miscellaneous bagatelles without opus numbers, and they ran the gamut from late elementary to advanced level in difficulty. In fact, the 3rd set, opus 126, is beyond the scope of this session on Beethoven's pedagogical works due to their difficulty. So instead, I want to take a few moments to discuss the other 2 collections, the Opus 33 and Opus 119. Now, his 7 bagatelles, Opus 33, were completed in 1802 and then published in 1803. So they were written about the same time as his 3rd piano concerto and his 2nd symphony. These pieces can be described as witty, as energetic, and they're generally more difficult technically than his Opus 119. They do show an influence of folk music, usually with large leaps, offbeat accents. Well, let me show you one. His 3rd in this collection, in F major, is a 6/8 work in the character of Haydn in that it's filled with harmonic surprises. This could be a student's first experience with the mature writing of Beethoven, as this piece is actually a level 8 piece. It would be an excellent preparation for the playing of one of his easier sonata movements. This particular bagatelle is in ternary form, ABA form, with a coda, which is based on the B section. Just notice the unexpected harmonic change from F major to D major in the 2nd phrase in measure 5. challenge for the student here might be the careful pedaling required due to the dissonances and non-harmonic tones. I think this piece also requires a subtle use of rubato. Now, Beethoven's 11 Bagatelles, Opus 119, were completed in 1822 and published as a complete set the following year. This is when he was writing his late piano sonatas, in particular Opus 109, 110, and 111, as well as the Diabelli variations and his Missa Solemnis, just to kind of put things in perspective for you. Looking at this set, some scholars believe that Beethoven wrote each of these bagatelles as an experiment, or as a solution to a specific compositional problem he was facing. One interesting observation about these pieces that would support this idea is that Beethoven did not write a single dynamic marking throughout the entire opus. He apparently wasn't concerned about the musical aspect of these bagatelles. Now, while I can't say whether that's precisely the case, that they're written solely or primarily as compositional exercises, what we do know is that they were written over a period of several years, and some of them were published individually years before they were all published under one opus in 1823. So Beethoven most likely wasn't thinking of them as a set or a cycle. The entire set of 11, by the way, was finally published in 1823 by Clementi. Well, let me show you a couple of my favorites. Number 3 in D major is kind of a dance-like piece it's just a wonderful dance-like character. Now, I must pause here for a moment and explain something. Beethoven, thought of today as a great composer, was also the greatest pianist of his age. Only Franz Liszt could approach Beethoven's virtuosity, and that was decades after Beethoven's death, and with a very different instrument, by the way. Tom Schnabel says that 3 great sources of Beethoven's angst were his encroaching deafness, his torturous stomach ailments, and the fact that the pianos available to him were utterly inadequate vehicles to capture his genius. Following this line of thought about Beethoven's pianos, Jan Swafford comments in his very lengthy tome, but excellent book, Beethoven's His Anguish and Triumph. He says, what Beethoven wanted from pianos, as he wanted from everything, was more robust build, more fullness of sound, a bigger range of volume, a wider range of notes. As soon as new notes were added to either end of the keyboard, he used them, making them necessary to anyone wanting to play his work. From early on, piano makers asked for Beethoven's opinion, and they listened to what he said. So, what does any of this have to do with the bagatelles? Well, here's an interesting observation about the particular bagatelle you just heard in D major. The range of Beethoven's 1817 Broadwood forte piano was 73 keys. If counting middle C as C4, this piano's range was C1 to C7. However, the top note of this bagatelle is a D7. It's one step above the highest note on his keyboard. In other words, Beethoven is writing a piece for piano that was unplayable due to the limitations of his keyboard. He needed that one more note. But that's Beethoven, right? Always pushing the boundaries. Fortunately, our pianos today have more than enough keys, and this piece, although there's much repetition, is simply a fun piece to play. You might have noticed I actually took the repeats for the first part of this piece when I played it. I'm typically not playing repeats for sake of time, but it's fun to play. It does require of the student a strong inner pulse and a good understanding of the dance-like character, this rhythmic gesture. This piece would be considered a level 7 piece. One last bagatelle, popular bagatelle I want to mention is number 9 in A minor. This one's a little easier than the number 3 in D. This is probably level 6. It's a short piece with a broken right hand chord pattern and a waltz-like bass. It can be found in many different editions. piece is in three-part form, ABA, note coda, and the entire piece is based on this same harmonic progression, the 1 to a flat 2, 6 chord, 5, 7, 1, repeated 4 times. The technical challenge here for students would be the constant extension and contraction of the right hand. I think the musical challenge would be to shape the phrase to move forward the first 3 measures to the top of the crescendo, using a slight rubato to ease the tension at the subito piano. Well, there are so many gems in the Bagatelles, I could actually do a whole session just on these pieces. But for the sake of time, let me just share the reason why these pieces should find their way into your students' repertoire. Students typically play Beethoven's piano sonatas too soon in their technical and musical development. In most cases, it is because they're attracted by the familiarity and popularity of these compositions. However, the Bagatelles are ideal repertoire to study before the sonatas because many of the technical and specific musical challenges pianists encounter in the sonatas are presented in the Bagatelles, only in a much shorter form. The fact that they are relatively compact and concise works allows the student to study Beethoven's musical style in miniature form before approaching his large-scale compositions. Do keep in mind, however, that some of the Bagatelles are actually more difficult than his easiest sonatas, the Opus 49 sonatas, and many are comparable to the difficulty of Opus 10 or Opus 14. So they may or may not be stepping stones to the sonatas, depending on which ones you use. But with that in mind, I'd like to share with you a graded learning sequence for some of the Bagatelles you might consider using in your studio. In particular here, I want to show you how they could correlate with the introduction of various Beethoven sonatas or sonata movements. This list is just a sampling, but hopefully gives you some ideas. And since this list, of course, is in your handout, I won't take time now to go through it with you. And since I mentioned the sonatas, let's move to that genre. But first, let's touch on his sonatinas. Beethoven wrote 2 easy sonatinas, and compared to some of the Bagatelles previously mentioned, they're definitely easier. The first here, Sonatina in G major, would be considered a level 3 piece. It's a popular work. It's in 2 movements. It would make a great introduction to the playing of sonatinas in general. In the first movement, you should note the 2-note slurs. I think that's important. And in the second movement, in sonata allegro form, it's very graceful and dance-like. That's important for the character of that particular movement. The second sonatina is in F major, and the first movement is one of the most frequently played teaching pieces by Beethoven, and for good reason. The energetic scale passages, the rapid broken chord accompaniments, and its cheerful nature. I've used this piece with students many times, and students have always enjoyed learning it. It's a bit more tricky than the first, but it's still only level 4. Beethoven wrote 3 Bonn sonatas, so titled because he composed them in Bonn when he was 13 years old. In spite of the word sonata, these pieces are actually more like sonatinas. And again, they're great introductory works leading up to his actual 32 sonatas. Now, the first Bonn sonata is in E flat major, and this first movement is the strongest of this sonata. Because of some of the double note passages that add to the difficulty of this movement, it's listed as a level 8 piece. Even though he was 13 years of age, you can definitely hear Beethoven in this piece. The second Bonn sonata is in F minor, also a level 8 piece. probably the most satisfying of the Bond sonatas, and you maybe have already noticed it has many similarities to his famous Pathetique sonata, including an opening introduction marked larghetto, a slow recurring section filled with strong emotional effect, sudden dynamic changes, frequent alteration between fast and then furious passage work, and then the slow chordal sections. Because of all this, the first movement really would be an excellent substitute for his Pathetique sonata, Opus 13. For the student who wants to play this famous sonata but isn't quite ready, this piece is more accessible. And by the way, don't just play the first movement, it's all good. The last movement contains some really exciting passage work as well. The third and final Bond sonata is in D major. This is the most difficult and least known of the three. It's about the same level as his F minor sonata, Opus 2, number 1, which is level 9. Kind of a tuneful melody, it's somewhat Haydn-esque in quality, I think. It has rapid 16th note figures and is more musically sophisticated in his second movement than the other Bond sonatas. One miscellaneous piece I want to throw in here because I'm not sure where else to put it, but it's Beethoven's Rondo in C major, Opus 51, number 1. I mention it here because I believe this work could easily substitute as a repertoire choice for a Beethoven sonata movement. It's a level 8 piece, so it could precede many of his sonatas. It would be another excellent choice for a student who isn't quite ready to play the sonatas. It's rewarding really to study and perform. The 32 sonatas are landmark works in the pianist repertoire. As they're pretty well known to most pianists, let me just share here the most accessible sonatas for an advancing pianist. The first one, I think, the most accessible, is Opus 49, number 2 in G major. This would be a level 7, a level 8 piece. Perhaps the most accessible of all the sonatas, it has this triplet figuration in both hands in the first movement that needs careful work or careful inflection. The final movement, it's marked tempo diminuendo, is much like a Kuhlau sonatina movement. The Opus 49, number 1 in G minor is level 8, just slightly more challenging, I believe, than number 2. This Andante first movement contains many different ideas and some intricate figurations. It's a little more difficult, I think, than musically speaking, than it may initially appear. The Rondo Allegro is excellent for working on rapid staccato passages, the fast 16th note accompaniment patterns. It's very effective writing. And then third would be this Opus 79 sonata in G major. This is level 9. This is one of the most attractive of the easier sonatas that isn't heard as often as I think it should be. The opening theme of this first movement is taken from an Austrian Ländler dance, so one must capture that folk-like quality in the music. The second movement's a 9/8 time, sort of like a barcarolle, a lyrical double note melody, rocking left-hand accompaniments, and a third movement very lively rondo. Now after this, it's kind of a bit of a toss-up. The next 6 sonatas are excellent options for the advancing pianist, and each has its own challenges. They're all considered level 10, which would be early advanced, and if I had to rank them in ascending difficulty, it might be a bit arbitrary, but I would probably have to go with the following order. After the 3 I just mentioned, the next most accessible Beethoven sonata might be Opus 14, number 1 in E major. It's a fine choice for an advancing performer, although not frequently heard. The slow movement, by the way, is one of the most accessible movements of the Beethoven sonatas. Then Opus 14, number 2 in G major. First movement is constructed on a broken chord that fits the hand well. Final movement is a scherzo, very light, dance-like. Opus 2, number 1 in F minor would be next, in my opinion. The opening movement has that upward leaping broken chord. It's a very effective piece, very effectively written. Opus 10, number 1 in C minor opens with a strong broken chord figure, the dotted rhythms, which must be played precisely, by the way, not as triplets. Very appealing writing, but the performer needs to pay close attention to all the details in the score to make this piece really effective. And then Opus 13 in C minor, the famous Pathetique sonata. The name Pathetique, by the way, was only one of 2 titles given by Beethoven to his sonatas. First movement, of course, immensely popular, and for good reason. Each movement has its own pitfalls. As already mentioned, the Bond Sonata and F minor is a great precursor to studying this particular sonata. And then rounding out the easiest of the 32 sonatas, not that these are like easy, but the easiest of those is Opus 10, number 2 in F major. A lovely opening movement. I think it's more difficult to interpret than what the student may think, but it's just, again, lovely writing, really, really nice work. Finally, just to mention real quick here that if you're interested in your students learning a set of variations, Beethoven has many, but he has 2 excellent options for you. His 6 variations on a Swiss song is a charming and somewhat popular work. It consists of a theme and, well, 6 variations. It's a level 7 piece and it has some interesting writing and can be rather effective, I think, in performance. His other accessible set of variations is his 6 easy variations on an original theme. A little more difficult, it's level 8, but it's still a popular set, I think, worth considering. I hope I didn't talk too fast for you, and I hope you've enjoyed this kind of whirlwind tour through Beethoven's pedagogical works. I want to thank you for taking the time to go through this with me, and certainly if you have questions about any of these pieces, please feel free to email me. I'd be happy to talk with you in more detail about any of these pieces or any of these works. All these pieces, by the way, and the scores you saw on the screens came right off IMSLP. So everything that I shared with you is very accessible, public domain works right off IMSLP. And as I mentioned along the way, they're also found in multitudes of anthologies. So they're all very easily accessible works. So I've shared with you some options, some ideas to move beyond for release. I'd be interested in hearing your ideas as well. So feel free to share with me and with others your favorite Beethoven teaching piece. Again, thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to seeing you in person at our next KMTA State Conference.